March 27th, 1964. Good Friday, 36 minutes past 5 in the evening in southern Alaska. Offices have emptied early for the holiday. Schools have been closed all day. In Anchorage, families are sitting down to dinner in the late northern daylight. Snow still banked along the streets. At 5:36, 75 miles to the east, the floor of the Pacific Ocean breaks loose and does not stop breaking. The rupture tears through the earth for 600 miles, a crack propagating at 2 miles per second, unzipping the seam where the Pacific Ocean floor grinds beneath North America. In Anchorage, the shaking begins gently, the way small earthquakes do. Alaskans know small earthquakes. They wait for it to pass. It does not pass. It builds. 10 seconds, 30. The ground stops trembling and starts rolling. Pavement moving in visible waves, like the surface of open water. A full minute. Buildings that were engineered to survive shaking begin to discover that no one ever asked them to survive shaking this long. 2 minutes, 3. The magnitude will be measured at 9.2. To this day, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America, and the second most powerful ever recorded on Earth. The shaking lasts 4.5 minutes. And when it finally stops, the disaster is not over. It has barely started. Because this earthquake has just done something to the ocean. And within half an hour, the sea will begin erasing coastal villages, whose names the rest of America has never heard. Before the night is out, the deadliest water of all will arrive 4,000 miles of coastline away in California. 131 people will die. And in the ruins, one geologist walking the broken coastline will find, written into the rock and the barnacles, the answer to the biggest unsolved question in Earth science. This earthquake didn't just change Alaska, it proved, for the first time, how the planet itself works. To understand what this earthquake destroyed and what it revealed, you need 2 pictures of 1964, one of Alaska, one of science itself. Alaska had been a state for barely 5 years. Anchorage was its boomtown. About 100,000 people, new schools, new office blocks, a downtown rising fast on oil money and military payrolls. Modern buildings going up quickly in a place where the deep rules of the ground had never been written down. Along the coast of Prince William Sound, life ran on the water. Fishing ports like Valdez and Seward, built at the feet of glaciers, their economies standing literally on their docks. And scattered between them, native Alaskan villages that had lived with this coastline for thousands of years. Places like Chenega, 20-odd families on a beach facing the sound. And that youth carried a blind spot into the ground itself. Anchorage's building boom had run ahead of any real understanding of what it was building. The city had gone up fast, in a place with no long written record of earthquakes, and, in the early 60s, hardly any meaningful seismic code to answer to. Engineers designed for wind, for snow, for permafrost. The deep behavior of the local ground under sustained shaking was, at the moment of the boom, essentially an unopened file. The city was, without knowing it, a full-scale experiment awaiting its stress test. New architecture, unmapped foundations, and a fault offshore that had been silently loading for centuries. Now the second picture, because it is the reason this story matters far beyond Alaska. In 1964, geology had a heresy problem. Half a century earlier, a German scientist named Alfred Wegener had noticed that the continents fit together like torn pieces of one page and proposed that they drift, that the map of the world moves. He was ridiculed for it, more or less to his grave. By the 60s, the idea was creeping back under a new name, plate tectonics, with new evidence from the ocean floors. But it remained exactly that, an idea, fiercely argued, unproven, and resisted by much of the field. What the theory fatally lacked was a witnessed experiment, one event measured with modern instruments that only moving plates could explain. The experiment was scheduled for 5:36 p.m., Good Friday. Nobody knew they had front row seats. This is the kind of story this channel exists for, the disaster behind the disaster told properly. If that's why you're here, subscribe, and the next one finds you. A magnitude of 9.2 is a number that hides its own meaning, so spend 20 seconds on what it actually says. The magnitude scale is logarithmic. Each full step upward releases about 32 times more energy than the last. A 9.2 is not a bit worse than the 7s that make world news every year. It releases hundreds of times their energy. In those 4.5 minutes, this one fault movement released more energy than every other earthquake on the planet, combined, for years. The Earth itself was set vibrating like a struck bell. For weeks afterward, the whole planet rang with slow oscillations. Water sloshed out of swimming pools in Texas. Wells twitched in South Africa. Boats swayed in the bayous of Louisiana, 4,000 miles from Anchorage, moved by a quake their owners never felt. But for the people inside it, the number that mattered was not 9.2. It was 270, the seconds the shaking lasted. Most earthquakes, even great ones, are over in under a minute. Buildings are, in effect, asked to survive a short, violent sprint. Alaska's buildings were asked to run a marathon at sprint violence. Structures that rode out the first minute intact were still being worked, joint by joint, weld by weld, in the third and fourth. Duration, as much as power, is what dismantled Anchorage. There is also a scientific reason the shaking announced itself before it arrived, and survivors' accounts keep describing it. An earthquake radiates two main kinds of waves. The first, the P wave, is a compression pulse, fast, relatively gentle, the Earth's knock on the door. The S wave and the surface waves behind it are slower and carry the violence. From a rupture 75 miles away, Anchorage got a few seconds of that knock, a shiver, dogs upset, hanging lamps beginning to stir, before the destructive waves landed. In a modern city that Gap feeds automated alarms, in 1964, it was just long enough for people to look up, decide it was another routine tremor, and stay put. The most dangerous seconds of the whole 4.5 minutes were the first few, when everything about the event was still saying, "This is normal." On 4th Avenue, the heart of downtown, one entire side of the street settled and dropped. Storefronts sinking until their doors stood below the sidewalk opposite. A business district turned into a staircase. The facade of the brand new J.C. Penney building peeled off and fell into the street in slabs. At Government Hill, an elementary school broke in half and slumped into a chasm, a photograph that would have been a national tragedy on any other weekday. On Good Friday, the classrooms were empty. Keep that detail. It returns at the end of this story with interest. The duration did one more thing. It gave people time to think inside the disaster, a luxury most earthquakes never allow, and a curse. Survivors describe complete decision cycles unfolding mid-quake, getting a family under a doorframe, concluding it would end, watching it not end, and having to make a second plan, then a third, while the street outside moved in swells and the view through the window rose and fell. At Anchorage's airport, the new control tower, 60 feet of reinforced concrete, swayed through the early minutes, and then failed, killing the controller on duty inside. One of the very few deaths in the city itself, and a grim proof that even purpose-built structures had never been asked the 4-minute question. And through the failing city moved a voice. A local radio reporter named Jeannie Chance made it to a police cruiser, then to a working transmitter, and simply started talking, relaying news, missing persons, instructions, calm, hour after hour through the night, to a city with no power and no other thread connecting it. Across south-central Alaska, families sat in dark kitchens around battery radios and held on to her voice. She stayed on the air for days. If Anchorage did not tip into panic that night, she is a large part of the reason. The most unnerving destruction in Anchorage, though, wasn't anything falling down. It was the ground itself changing its mind about being solid. Turnagain Heights was the city's showcase neighborhood, modern homes along a bluff with a panoramic view of the inlet. What its residents did not know was what the bluff stood on, a buried layer of marine sediment called the Bootlegger Cove clay. Clays like it hold a dangerous secret. Their strength comes from a delicate internal card house of particles, locked in place since the Ice Age, strong enough to hold a city block, right up until sustained shaking collapses the card house. Then, almost instantly, the clay stops behaving like ground and starts behaving like a dense fluid. Engineers call the family of failures liquefaction. Residents of Turnagain experienced it as their front lawns beginning to move. Minutes into the shaking, the buried clay layer failed, and the entire bluff, homes, streets, trees, cars, broke into blocks and began flowing toward the sea, the surface shattering into tilting slabs with the houses riding on top like rafts on ice. Some homes slid hundreds of feet, folding as they went. 75 of them were destroyed. People scrambled across ground that was opening and closing over crevasses where their gardens had been, carrying children between moving blocks of what had been their street. The slide carried parts of the neighborhood out past where the shoreline itself had stood minutes earlier. When it stopped, survivors stood on a landscape with no reference points left. No straight street, no level lot. The wreckage of a model suburb tilted at every angle above the mud. It is one thing for a disaster to break what people built. Turnagain did something worse to the people watching. It broke the assumption that the ground is a place where things stay. On the coast of Prince William Sound, the 4.5 minutes were only the overture. What killed people there arrived minutes later, and it came out of the harbors themselves. Port towns in glacial fjords are built on underwater slopes of loose sediment, steep deltas of gravel and silt dumped for centuries by rivers at exactly the places where docks make sense. The shaking took those slopes the way it had taken Turnagain, whole underwater hillsides let go at once. And when a mountain of sea floor slumps into deep water, the displaced sea has to go somewhere, straight back at the shore within minutes as a wave. This is the crucial, brutal distinction of this disaster. These first waves were not the famous ocean-crossing tsunami. They were local, landslide-born, and unwarnable. No alert system on Earth, then or now, can beat a wave that is generated inside the harbor itself. In Valdez, a freighter, the SS Chenega, was tied up at the town dock, and unloading day was a local event. Among the crowd on the dock were kids earning pocket money, helping with cargo. When the waterfront's underwater slope collapsed, the dock and the people on it went down into the sea, and the harbor rose up as a wave that heaved the 10,000-ton ship upward and inland. Her crew looked down at the town from above it before the water carried her back out. 32 people died at the Valdez waterfront. No one on the dock survived. The ground under the town was so unstable that engineers later condemned the entire site. The Valdez that exists today stands 4 miles away. The original town site was ultimately burned and abandoned to the tides. In Chenega, the native village on the Sound, there was not even a harbor's worth of warning. The sea withdrew and then returned as a wall that took the village off its beach. 23 people died out of a community of perhaps 75, nearly 1 in 3. The survivors, some of whom outran the wave uphill through snow, watched their entire world, homes, church, boats, and a third of their neighbors, go back out with the water. Chenega was not rebuilt on that beach. Its name survives because its people refused to let it die, founding a new village years later on another island. In Seward, the underwater slope failure came with fire. The waterfront fuel tank farm ruptured and ignited, and survivors described the impossible image of the wave that hit the town, burning. A moving wall of seawater carrying flaming oil into the streets. Kodiak lost its fishing fleet and canneries to waves that lifted boats over the breakwater and parked them among the houses. And in Whittier, a port so hemmed in by mountains that most of its population lived in a single building, the local waves arrived within minutes of the shaking and killed 13 people in a town of about 70. The fjords made every one of these waves worse. A wave that would spread and dilute along an open coast is instead funneled between rock walls, its energy compressed into the exact narrow slots where the towns are. The same geography that made these harbors perfect made them traps. All of that, Valdez, Chenega, Seward, Kodiak, was Alaska's local catastrophe, over within the hour. But the main event had been launched at 5:36 and was still out there. The rupture had lifted a 600-mile stretch of seafloor, shoving the entire column of ocean above it. That displaced sea was now spreading across the Pacific at the speed of a jetliner, and it had appointments to keep all night down 4,000 miles of North American coastline. If you're still here, you're exactly who this channel is built for. Subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it's the whole reason these keep getting made. In the open ocean, a tsunami is nearly invisible, a broad swell inches to feet high, hundreds of miles long, racing at 500 miles per hour. Ships at sea felt nothing that night as it passed beneath them. It is only at the coast, where the shallowing bottom trips the wave and stacks its enormous length upward, that the sea shows what it has been carrying. Its first stops were Alaskan, the outer coast, then the long southeastern shore, the wave-logging arrivals like a schedule. Then British Columbia, where it ran up the inlets of Vancouver Island and smashed waterfronts in the middle of the night. Then the Washington and Oregon coasts, beaches, moorings, and in Oregon, a family camping at the mouth of a creek. 4 children lost to a wave on a night no one imagined belonged to Alaska. The Pacific coast of an entire continent was, for one night, a single connected crime scene with one cause, hundreds of miles apart between its impacts. Warnings, this time, existed. The wave took hours to travel, and word moved ahead of it down the coast. In Crescent City, a small harbor town in far northern California whose offshore geography focuses tsunami energy like a lens, the alert came in and the waterfront was cleared. Then the first wave arrived, modest. A second, smaller. A third, smaller still. And here, the night turned on the single most dangerous fact about tsunamis, one that 1964's warning system did not yet carry. A tsunami is not a wave. It is a train of waves, hours long, and the largest is very often not the first. The sea looked finished. People went back, shop owners to assess the damage, a group at a waterfront tavern to salvage, and, when the place proved intact, to catch their breath while the night seemed to be ending. The fourth wave came in the dark, and it was the largest by far. Around 21 feet of ocean that took out 29 city blocks and most of the waterfront. 11 people died in Crescent City that night, most of them people who had already evacuated once and come back. To this day, it remains the deadliest tsunami strike in the history of the contiguous United States, and it wrote the rule that every coastal warning now carries in bold. The all clear is the deadliest bulletin of the night, and no one sounds it until the whole train has passed. When the water settled, the United States Geological Survey sent teams north, and among the geologists was a man named George Plafker. What he did over the following months turned a catastrophe into the most important field experiment in the history of Earth science. Plafker's tools were almost comically modest for the job. Boats, float planes, notebooks, tide tables. His genius was noticing that the earthquake had left behind its own measuring instruments, alive and stuck to the rocks. Barnacles. Barnacles grow in a precise band of the tide line. Wherever the land had risen, the old barnacle bands now stood high and dry above the highest tides. A white stripe of dead shellfish painted on the rock, marking exactly how far the coast had lifted. On Montague Island, he measured the stripe at up to 38 feet of uplift, the greatest coastal rise ever recorded in a single earthquake. Elsewhere, whole forests and harbor towns had dropped. Ground sunk as much as 8 feet, tides now drowning land that had been dry for generations, stands of trees standing dead in salt water. One detail shows how deep the confusion ran before he closed it. In the first weeks, scientists could not even find the fault. An earthquake this size should have torn a visible scar across the landscape. California's earthquakes leave fences offset and roads split along a clean line. Alaska's monster had left no surface fault at all, anywhere, and for a while, that absence was a genuine mystery. Plafker's coastline measurements solved it. The fault hadn't broken the land because the fault wasn't in the land. It lay offshore and underfoot at once, a gently dipping plane running beneath the coast, its motion surfacing not as a crack, but as that vast, silent lifting and sinking of the whole margin. The scar was there. It was just 600 miles long, underwater, and written in elevation instead of rupture. Mapped across the whole region, the pattern was the fingerprint the argument had been waiting for. A vast band of uplift along the seaward side, a parallel trough of subsidence inland, exactly and only what you would get if the floor of the Pacific were thrusting down and under Alaska along a single colossal fault, storing strain for centuries and releasing it in one motion. Not an idea, a measurement. Plafker's work, published the following year, showed that the 1964 earthquake was a megathrust, the ocean floor diving beneath a continent, and it landed in the middle of the plate tectonics debate like a verdict. Within a few years, the theory that had ended Wegener's career as a punchline had become the accepted foundation of Earth science. Every plate boundary you have ever seen drawn on a map is, in part, downstream of a man in a float plane, reading dead barnacles on Alaskan rock. Now come back to the number from the beginning, because it should bother you. 9.2, 4.5 minutes, an entire coastline rearranged, and 131 dead. An earthquake of this size striking a modern coast could plausibly kill 100,000. Why didn't it? Partly, Alaska was lucky in its calendar. Good Friday. Schools closed. Offices emptied early. The collapsed school stood empty. The dropped downtown was between its working hours. Partly lucky in its buildings. Wood frame houses, the Alaskan default. Flex, where masonry snaps. Most homes bent and held. Partly lucky in its emptiness. 600 miles of rupture facing one of the least populated coastlines in America. Move the same fault motion beneath a crowded coast on a school day, and the arithmetic runs the other way. The low toll of 1964 was not a mild earthquake. It was a monstrous earthquake that happened to fire into mostly empty air. There is also a chapter of that survival which no calendar can claim, and it belongs to the people. When the shaking stopped, South Central Alaska was a subarctic region in March, with its power dead, its water mains broken, its roads and rail lines snapped, and night coming down toward freezing. What followed, by every account, was the opposite of collapse. Neighborhoods pooled generators and camp stoves. Ham radio operators stitched the cut-off towns back into contact, and the military mounted one of the largest domestic airlifts the country had run. Cargo aircraft shuttling food, medicine, and engineers into a state whose ports had just been destroyed by the sea and whose highways had been dropped into it. A disaster of this scale in deep cold could have doubled its own death toll in the first week. It didn't. And that arithmetic was written by ordinary Alaskans in parkas, working in the dark. What wasn't luck is what came after. The blindness that killed at Crescent City was engineered away. The modern tsunami warning system for the entire American Pacific, the one watching every megathrust on the ocean's rim tonight, was built directly out of this event, with its Alaska Center standing in Palmer, up the road from the wreckage that justified it. Anchorage rebuilt on new rules. The ground itself, including the failed clay under Turnagain, was mapped, zoned, and in places simply retired from ever carrying homes again. Even the barnacles had a sequel. In the decades since, surveyors remeasuring Plafker's coastline have watched some of the 1964 movements slowly reversing. Land that leapt upward, gently sinking again. Land that dropped, creeping back up. The visible breathing of a fault reloading itself. The strain that took perhaps 5 to 9 centuries to build before Good Friday began accumulating again on the afternoon of March 27, 1964, and has not stopped since. Alaska's clock is running. It is simply early in the count. And one more thing came out of 1964, and it is the reason this story is not history. Plafker's proof means the machine is understood, and the machine is not unique. The same geometry that broke Alaska, an ocean plate diving beneath North America, locked, storing centuries of strain, continues down the coast. Its next segment runs from Canada to California, a few dozen miles offshore from Seattle and Portland, and it has not fired since the year 1700. Alaska 1964 is the only full-scale demonstration ever recorded on instruments of what that fault will do, which is a different story, and it's already waiting. The fault next door is called Cascadia, same machine aimed at Seattle and Portland, and geologically speaking, it is running late. We've told that story too. Subscribe, and it's waiting for you right now.